Think of your own favorite social, economic, activist issue. One of mine is early childhood support for reading. We all know what happens to kids who, if they get to school and haven't had the right exposure to words, etc. $7 billion could easily mean that every single child born in this country could be school ready before they show up. And, you know, just pick another one. If I spend that much time on all the rest of them, I won't make this in a 100-yard dash. Gerrymandering. It's been done by both parties forever. At the moment, because there are more Republican governors and legislatures, they have had control. I'll pick one. Ohio's where I know politics deep, deep, deep. Marcy Kaptur is one of the longest sitting members of the House of Representatives. She has been the representative from Toledo, Ohio. I'm going to forget the number of years. When she first began to run, her district, like was true of most districts, encompassed the metropolitan area of Toledo and was completely rational in terms of geography. Google it, look her district up today. It looks like a snake. It runs from west of Toledo all across Lake Erie, almost to the eastern border of Ohio, skinny, 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 where systematically voters were identified so that enough Democrats were in that place that she will get reelected all the time. But meanwhile, 3 other districts have been created that are now Republican safe. Okay? This is one, if you are interested, there is real grassroots work happening to begin to get redistricting put in the hands of citizen commissions. Michigan won this issue. In fact, this is another, I'm not going to make it in a 100-yard dash. A young woman named Katie Fahey, who was afraid to go home for Thanksgiving dinner, multi-generational family. She called her cousins and said, I don't want to go home. Do you want? No, Uncle John is going to be blah, 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 blah. So they said, let's come up with an idea. Let's go to Thanksgiving proactively, put an idea on the table, and see what we could do with it. They did that. And what they put on the table was, why don't we start a process to get a citizens' initiative ballot to change redistricting in Michigan to not be in the hands of the governor and the legislature, but to be a citizen-driven commission. They had to get 330 signatures in some unbelievable amount of time. They got 442,000. Both parties challenged those signatures. They were then validated. It got on the ballot. Both parties went to say there were ways in which they got it on the ballot, that it shouldn't be on the ballot. Long story short, it won. The Michigan legislature is trying to undo parts of it, but nonetheless, it is now the law in Michigan that it is a citizen commission. Katie Fahey and her team, it was done completely grassroots. Her instincts were amazing. The way she organized it was every county in Michigan had 2 leaders, young leaders, a Republican, a dyed-in-the-wool young Republican, and a dyed-in-the-wool young Democrat. And what they did together before they started the work was sit down and get to know each other as people. And then they recruited other R's and D's that did the same thing. Katie Fahey and her colleagues have now started a national organization called The People. And they, on May 17, 18, and 19, will have 100 young people in Washington, a Republican and a Democrat from every state, to talk through a strategy of how to start this. So you think you can't do something about this? Lots you can do. Ranked choice voting. I'm just going to do 2 more things, and then 24 news cycle, 24/7 news cycle, social media. The internet has completely changed the information ecology of our country. We now live in filter bubbles. We can pick what news we want to hear. So we are reinforcing what we already believe as opposed to getting new data. In some ways, I have to tell you, this one shakes me up almost worse than our current incivility, because I actually think it's going to take a long time. But we care enough about being connected to one another. There's enough emphasis on that that I think we'll move forward. This thing about how we now get our information and how we've left the land of facts, I think it's going to be much harder to get us out of that one. The last one that has been in the news a lot lately is the whole issue of rising social isolation. the number of people who aren't connected in a meaningful way. And here's a scary piece. Think about what happened in New Zealand. That's the first time it's been totally visible to the world that what we thought, what we knew, all of the mass shootings that have been done in the United States of America, the profile of those persons have been dominantly white males who are socially isolated. There are a few exceptions to it, but that is the category. What we didn't understand and what is now visible because of New Zealand, what once were socially isolated people who felt no community support for their actions are connecting worldwide on the web. They know each other's names, they're following each other's suits. So we've got a funny dynamic going on here in terms of virtual reality, pulling people out of social isolation that is actually having a profoundly negative impact. Why am I spending time on this? If we could get even half of that 75% of Americans to once again understand one another and connect with one another, we have to do something about these structural issues as well. You may have a pre-inclination to work on that side. And what you might want to go to a website called Bridge Alliance. 95 democracy reform organizations are represented on that website. Every one of them is doing action in one of these areas, and it is completely cross-partisan. So find the topic that you care the most about on the structural issues if you're so inclined that direction. Okay. Again, I want to leave you, I've said this in different ways, but it's really essential. It's fundamental to this work. Human beings are social beings. We respond to the context we're in, the structure we're in that context, and the signals we're getting. You can take the same human being and put them here and send them a lot of signals about debt and deficit, about how we've got to get out of it and there are ways to solve it. And guess what? They step up and start ready to work on debt and deficit. You can take that same person and put them over here and in an election cycle have Republicans yell at them, no new taxes, no new revenues, and have the Democrats yell at them, no spending cuts, no spending cuts. And whether they're Republican, they'll revert to that form. Even though over there, when they had all the facts, they actually understood you have to both cut taxes and reduce spending or we'll never get out of a deficit. But put them here and keep them focused only on the partisan description of that issue, and they will pull the lever, as we have been doing for decades, on the issue of debt and deficit. Have I said enough to make the point? So when you're dealing with a local issue, stop and think about the people who are the antagonists in it. What's the structure they're sitting in? What are the signals they're sitting in? And how can you create a different structure? Send a different set of signals. And that opens the door for something different to happen. Civility and protest. This first became a very profound issue at our office when the immigration policy on the border was separating children and families. And I want to tell you, it was a maelstrom. Some of you will remember that less than 24 hours after there began to be a huge public outcry about the immorality of separating children from families at the border, what happened with the national media, because they follow the president's tweet, was a Twitter war between President Trump and Maxine Waters. You remember that? And that's part of the genius, I hate to use the word, of the way this administration is communicating. A real issue happens, the American public uprises, and a shift happens that takes it completely out of the issue into a meaningless Twitter war. I think the hardest work I have done in this job, in terms of intellectually, was thinking through how to write a piece which did run in the Hill in Washington, D.C., and I don't think I put it in the PowerPoint, but I could send it to you, about how to express in 800 to 1,200 words that if you look at the tradition of who we are as a country, The issue of civility as essential to democracy and protest totally grew up side by side. The Founding Fathers in the Constitutional Convention actually talked about civility. They actually had conversations about the importance of that to democracy. And meanwhile, while they were in Constitution Hall, I think we had something called the Boston Tea Party. That was a pretty serious protest that eventually turned into a revolution. So each of these values, the value of protest and the importance of civility and respect to a democratic society, they have grown up side by side in this country. And for anybody to say, okay, now we're in this protest about children on the border, so civility out the door. The title of the piece I wrote was "Incivility is not the answer." We just have to figure out, and I often use Martin Luther King. Obviously in the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference never could have accomplished what it accomplished if we hadn't had the Radical Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee over here. So it takes to bring social change both of these streams of work. But what we're watching right now is very often when protest starts, it becomes a legitimate reason to say civility and respect aren't welcome here. I'm sad to say, as I'm sure many of you are, that the University of Arizona has just been in the barrel on this issue. And unfortunately, not only did you get amazing local coverage, it has been in most major news outlets around the country. On Tuesday morning, I don't know if any of you were there or it is live streamed and you can look at it, President Robbins held what will be the first step that he called a campus conversation, which was totally a listening session for people to come and describe all of the perspectives they have on the issue. Keith Allred, the new executive director, and I were there. We were sitting literally in the row behind the probably 25 to 30 very organized activists who intentionally disrupted many times, but frankly, did it pretty respectfully, I would say. What stood out to me, and I think for anybody who can help with this in this community, is the conversation that took place in that room is actually reflecting 300 years of history in this geography, in this country. It is reflecting issues that happened here long before we were formally the United States of America. And it may not be that anybody in the room is saying that, but if you listen carefully, you hear language that is reflecting generations of experience of being otherized, and therefore, by definition, carrying fear in your DNA. And the University of Arizona is an incredibly diverse student body with thousands of young people who come from the same background that I come from, who have no experience whatsoever of how or why someone should be afraid that a Border Patrol officer or an ICE officer is coming onto campus. This is going to take some community holding. And frankly, given what I've seen in the newspaper around some of the members of the legislature, frankly, from what I've heard in the background from some of the big donors of the U of A, this is a moment when your administration needs support from the community. And it needs support from the community. You may have very different ideas about what should or should not have happened, but it happened, and now we have to do something around the next steps to knit back the community, that there is room for me to be a third-generation Mexican-American that watched my mother be sent back across the border, or for me to be a white guy from Pennsylvania who hasn't got a clue of why you're afraid. What NICD will do, and we've stepped up to do it, is we will hold many, many, many small conversations between the diverse groups of students built on the same thing we do in every other community that we work in. That's slow, that takes time. The real difficulty in this circumstance, I'm going to say publicly, the basic thing that these students want, and some of you will know this history, this isn't the first time this has happened on campus. This is not the first time this group of students has asked for this to happen. What they want the university to do is to never again let the Border Patrol or ICE on campus. That's not possible. That would be illegal. But I hope to goodness that the administration doesn't hide behind the reality that it's illegal. Even if it weren't illegal, it's not the right thing to do. So how do you find the space to both figure out the system of we know who's coming on campus, when they're coming on campus, that groups of students can be warned so that groups of students can take care of themselves about where they are, when. I hope you'll all help. I hope you'll get facts and that you won't join one side or the other of the argument based on what you happen to know about it. Okay. At the same time, I'm going to do a little history now. How many of you know the origin story of the National Institute? Do you all know our origin story? The mass shooting in Tucson, January 8th, 2011, when 13 people were wounded, including Gabby, and 6 people died. The university came together with the community in lightning speed. And Fred Duvall was then the chairman of the Board of Trustees. Meredith Hay was the provost. The two of them took it forward to Phoenix and also here with the Board of Trustees. In 10 days, they announced that this institute should be created so that something good could come out of that tragedy. And not just people here in Tucson, but people, frankly, my life has been spent in Ohio, Iowa, briefly New York, and Washington, D.C. I'd never heard of Gabby Giffords. I mean, how many of you know a representative from a state that's 1,000 miles away from you? But when the incident happened, I looked her up. And I quickly learned that Gabby, from the beginning of her work here in Arizona and carried on to the House of Representatives, truly was working cross-partisan, truly had well, you know, she's dear friends with Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake and Gabby's views couldn't possibly be any more divergent. And the hope in the Institute was that we could do something about those profound gaps. I think most of the country thought that because she was a member of Congress, maybe something would happen on gun control. It didn't. How many more have we seen? And let's do a round for the Parkland students. For the first time, some things have actually happened on gun control. But I bring this up. The day I agreed to do this position and arrived on campus was July 1st, 2012. And there was basically nothing here. A half-time staff person, a fantastic national advisory board, a year's worth of good scholarly research, and no programming. And the invitation was that we should be a national organization that would receive attention to the work we did. It's been quite a journey. And I can honestly say to you that we now do get a level of national media coverage that most nonprofits would die for. And the reason we are getting it is twofold. We're doing good work, and we've got real stories and real evaluated outcomes. But we wouldn't be getting anywhere near the news coverage we're getting if we were not in the political climate that we're in. We actually are showing that there is an antidote to the toxicity that is ruling our political rhetoric. We work with elected officials, with the public, with the media, and since about September of last year is when we really crossed the Rubicon in terms of finally getting attention for several years' worth of highly evaluated positive work. Since that, we've had a front-page article in the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor. Judy Woodruff interviewed me on the PBS NewsHour. I know some of you heard it because I got messages from you which were heartwarming. We will be on PBS NewsHour again sometime in the next months telling the positive stories about what has now happened. NPR's Morning Edition, CBS Interactive, the Congressional Quarterly writes a big piece once a month about influential people in Washington, D.C. I want to tell you, they've never before written about the executive director of a small nonprofit. This month's influential leader is Keith Allred, the new executive director of NICD. So where we have come from in July 2012 to where we are today is pretty extraordinary. And that is the reason that I stand here saying I do feel extremely optimistic about what's possible with concerted, strategic focus. In the time we have left, I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of our major programs and hopefully leave you wanting to learn more. We work in state legislatures in a program called Next Generation. We do that because even in the last Congress, more than 50% of each new set of members that are given the installed actually comes straight from a state legislature to Congress, in the Senate and the House. So our strategy was, if we exposed and trained enough people when they were in state legislatures and they got committed to the policies and the practice of how to build respect across the aisle, that eventually that would be a critical mass large enough to make a difference in Congress. So far, we've worked deeply in 16 states, more than 1,000 legislators, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and occasional Libertarian, and occasional Green Party, and we'll do 5 more states this year. Our goal is to be in 40 states by 5 years from now. I think there are a few states that we will never get into. But frankly, don't follow a stereotype here. One of the states we've had the biggest impact in is Idaho. Idaho is as red as a state can get. I was actually a little nervous when Idaho contacted us. It was the president of the Senate, a lovely human being, who said the following. His name is Brent Hill. We've been following your work. We've called a lot of legislators in other states. We know what you do works, but so far you've only done it where there's a pretty decent balance of Republicans and Democrats. We have a little different situation here in Idaho. Our problem isn't the Democrats. Our problem is the increasing number of right-wing Republicans who are elected who are fashioning themselves after the Tea Party in Washington and want to create the same dynamic in Idaho. Well, I was a little nervous. Our state director was a little nervous. We'd never done it in that proportion before. So we proposed, let's come and pick all your leadership and let us come and do it with your leadership, which again would be very imbalanced Republican and Democrat. So we did that. I think there were 26 of them. It worked extremely well, and they are now some of our largest proponents. So that president and speaker then invited us in to train the entire legislature at once. Most times up till then, we've been doing groups of about 20, 25, and where do we get out? This is pretty good, so they bring us back to do another 20, 25. There are 105 members of the Idaho legislature. The day we did this training, or the 2 days we did this training, 104 members were present. The 105th member was not present, was a lawyer. A judge would not shift a court date. One of the things I understood when we started this, yeah, that's worth clapping about. Being an elected official, I don't know if we have any in the room, but hats off to you if we do. It's a very unique experience and getting tougher and tougher in this world in terms of the way you are treated by the public very often. So I really understood that the training of this, the leadership of this, should be done by members of the legislature themselves or former members rather than professionals like myself, because it was a whole life experience. So we immediately started working here at the U of A to do training of former legislators to do this workshop in the next set of states. And Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of this weekend, we will do our next facilitator training. And for the first time, we actually have more Republicans in that training than Democrats. So we're pretty excited about that. All right, I'm going to skip forward. This is the national network that we formed so they know each other when they get to Congress. There's actually some hope in Congress itself. Not this new group in 2018, but even the new group before was starting to hear from the public that they were sick to death of the character assassination. How can we trust you to be bipartisan when you get to Congress when you talk that way about your opponent now? So of the 53 new members that year, that should say 2016, not 2018. That year, 46 of them signed this Pledge of Civility. It's very, very strong language. You might want to. Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana, does the best posting on his website about the work they're doing. If this intrigues you and you want to send messages to Arizona members to sign if they haven't, I'd suggest you go to Mike's website. This is Steve Stover and Joyce Beatty from Central Ohio. They've both been trained by us. Steve is a quite Republican conservative, and Joyce is a very liberal Democrat. They are in existing districts one to another. They've started a civility caucus in Congress, which they think what they did was genius. You can't join unless you come as an R&D together, and you have to have an action project. And the action project that Joyce and Steve chose was to go to every public and private junior high school and high school in their 2 districts together, and they publicly say to students, have you ever seen a Democrat and a Republican do something positive together? And they then take the students through a whole process about the importance of civility and respect, including using some of our tools to do that. In working with the public, we've worked deeply in 4 states, Maine, Ohio, Iowa, and we're about to do a bigger deep dive in Arizona. Mayor Jonathan Rothschild, thank you, I don't know where I am with last names, was our first city. When we did it here, and we started this 2 years ago, 26 organizations in Tucson actually held civility work in their organization. We now want to cycle and come back to other cities in Arizona. I spent most of the morning talking about a collaboration with Arizona Town Hall, which you may well know does 15 to 20 community conversations all over the state every year. We're going to adjust schedule somewhat. We will do the first 45 minutes to an hour and 15 of training people how to do this communication, and they'll then take on the issue. So we're very excited about that. All right.
Well, a friend of mine passed away, and she was all about reconciliation, always about reaching out to people, and to unlikely people. When she passed away, I wanted to do something to honor her. And I thought, who would be the most unlikely person on the planet that I would reach out to? And it was Bob.
I'm the president and CEO of the Family Leader, and our mission statement is to strengthen families by inspiring Christ-like leadership in the home, the church, and government.
I'm the executive director at One Iowa, which is the state's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organization. I've been an activist and an advocate and sometimes an agitator in this movement for almost 30 years.
Well, Donna and I, we see the world very differently. And our view on marriage, on sexuality, and probably on a lot of other issues.
I guess you'd have to say that my impression of Bob was not only he was the opposition, he was the enemy.
I've probably made statements about her and her organization in the press. She's probably made statements about me and my organization in the press. We weren't natural allies. We weren't natural coffee buddies. And so she emailed the Family Leader and said, hey, I talked to Bob, and Bob said he'd be willing to do coffee. Let me know a good time and date. And so they shared that email with me like, is this true? I mean, is this real? And I said, yeah, it's real, but I never thought she'd follow up on it.
I never thought that he would respond.
And so we set a date to have coffee.
And that was the beginning of this amazing journey. I remember walking in just being very nervous. I had no idea what to expect, none at all.
Well, you know, the skeptic in me thought she would have an agenda, and she probably thought I might have an agenda. But as soon as we sat down, I thought, she doesn't have an agenda. She just wants to get to know who I am. And that really compelled me to say, I should want to get to know who she is.
I think when people have the courage to show you who they are, something happens. And so what surprised me about Bob was his humanity. He's an incredible dad. I also found him to be really funny, and I didn't expect that at all. But we laugh a lot.
Donna's a very good person. She's a passionate person. She has advocated for her issues tirelessly for over 3 decades. So regardless if I agree or disagree with her on the issues, I have a tremendous respect for her.
For a long time, I've been really tired of the hate and the aggression and the kind of snarkiness. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We can fight the good fight in the court of public opinion, but we don't have to hurt each other. That's, I think, the big takeaway for me. We don't have to hurt each other, because when we do that, we're hurting ourselves. We get coffee about once every couple of months.
And I think with Donna, her and I readily assessed that we have a lot of common interest. We have some common ground. The only regret in all of that is that I wasn't the one to ask her out for coffee. And she's the one who asked me out. And I'm glad she did, but I kind of feel like I should have.
What surprised me was, not that he liked me. I thought, yeah, he'd like me. What surprised me was I really liked him.
It hasn't changed my beliefs. It may have changed my approach, because when we do put out a press release, when we do make a public statement, many times I think, I wonder how Donna will view this.
Here's the deal. If Bob and I can have coffee, if we can tell stories and laugh and get to know each other, if we can like each other, then I think almost anyone can find that person in their life, and maybe they can reach out their hand and invite them in.
So I'm going to add just a tad more context to that video. And I'm sure the message came through. Donna's the foremost advocate for gay rights. Bob leads the family values. Bob was Ted Cruz's policy director in his 2016 presidential campaign. Those two human beings will never agree on gayness, never agree on why it happens, never agree on the policy statements policies we should have. But the most important statement in that video, I hope you caught it, was Bob saying, now when I write a press release, I stop and think, how would Donna respond? The two of them became such known public figures together, and their real friendship. Donna lost a battle to cancer last summer. She is loved in the gay community in Iowa. Everyone knew thousands of gay people would come to her memorial service. And her family chose to have Bob Vanderplat do one of the eulogies. That's what can happen when two people connect in their humanness and then put in context their differences on policy. I've seen that video hundreds of times, and it still gives me chills. We use that video when we train state legislators. We have now shown that video in the halls of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. We use that video with teenagers in high schools when we are working with them in a texting platform that we've created. This is readily available to you. Just go to YouTube and put in Unlikely Friendship, Donna and Bob. Download it and use it any way you would like. Now, I have used up the time that was allotted for me. However, there are still two things I'd like to tell you about. Can I do that? Yes. Okay, thank you. And I would have stopped if you said no. So I'm going to skip over a few slides that are more things I usually say about what you have to do to make what Donna and Bob did work. But you can look at those later on yourselves. We have a new initiative. Okay, here's where NICD is today. We have 6.5 years worth of work that has been evaluated by outside agencies that will say what we have done has changed legislators' behavior and has led to structural changes. I have to a good friend of mine is here from Maine. I have to tell you, my favorite structural example is what's happened in the Maine legislature. We have now trained every member of the Maine legislature. A foundation in Maine pays for the work to be done for each incoming class. So it is institutionalized. When they were seated in January, the new president of the Senate, and the new Speaker of the House got together and said, what are we going to do to get more real cross-partisan work done in this legislature? I don't know if any of you pay attention to Maine politics, but Maine had a Trump governor before Trump had even thought of running for president. So things were pretty bad there in terms of the party relationships. Here's what they did. They announced the seating chart for the House and the Senate. You know where this phrase across the aisle comes from? Because every legislature in the United States of America, the Republicans sit on one side, the Democrats sit on the other. Now in the state of Maine, the seating chart is RD, 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 RD. And as expected, it has built some relationships. It has led to conversations that no one expected to happen. And here's a shocker. Maine has just passed a version of a Green New Deal. And part of that is because of this actual communication. Okay, so what we know at NICD, what we do works. But, you know, we've reached 1,000 legislators in 5 years. That's a lot, but it's nothing. We've reached 60,000 ordinary people since about October of 2016. But excuse me, that's in the last 13 months. But that's almost nothing. If we're going to actually change this culture, all of this work has to go to scale. Somehow it has to touch hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, in ways that don't require the amount of work it takes us and the amount of resources it takes to bring people together face to face. How many of you know the name Daniel Yankelovich? He was with the Gallup poll organization. He was the first person that convinced a polling organization, it was the New York Times, to start using polls in their stories. In the latter part of his career, he came to understand, yes, polling has its place, but polling just gives you an aggregate of individual decisions. It never gives you insight into a collective public stable opinion. So he started looking into what could be done about this, and he proposed something in a book. Those of you who care about this sort of thing might want to look at it, called The Magic of Dialogue in the early 90s. And in it, he proposed something called proxy dialogue. His entire focus was television, because back then, that's the only place we looked at video. Today, everything I'm going to say, it could be television, it could be your phone, it could be your iPad, whatever device you use for streaming video. And here's what he said is theoretically, but it's since been researched many, many times, that if you watch a program on television or on your screen, whichever screen, and you have a strong emotional identification with one of the people that you are watching on that screen, that you can go through the same change in attitude that you watched that person go through. And you can even end up changing behavior based on your change of attitude. So that's happening all in a self-reflection mode based on, I feel like that Hispanic person I'm watching, or whatever it may be. So about 10 months ago, we teamed up with a group called No Voice Strategies, in which we decided to create a docuseries of civility TV. We started in Massachusetts, in the Boston greater area. And we did a small group, intentionally. We brought together 6 very, very strong Trump supporters and 6 very, very strong Trump detractors. We brought them together. We didn't tell them who was who. And we spent about they were together 48 hours. They spent the first about 6 or 7 hours with no background data about their politics, but just going through a series of experiences together, getting to know one another. They then laughed at each other a lot later, or laughed at themselves, in that they knew they were there for Trump and Trump, and they were trying to figure out who was who, and in many times they were wrong. They went on some physical stereotype, you must be that Trump supporter, and you turned out to be the most liberal person in the room. So we then went to Chicago and did a very diverse group of millennials. We intentionally did the first Boston group for something a lot of Americans haven't learned about the 2016 election. The big, big difference about who voted for who for Trump is all differences amongst white people. In terms, you could change the entire people of color vote and it doesn't shift that election in any way, shape, or form. So we did some testing. If you bring pro-Trump and anti-Trump people together and mix the races, you know what I'm going to say. The conversation ends up being more about race than it does about politics. So we wanted a sample where by definition the race issue did not overpower what we were trying to demonstrate. We also got a lot of negative feedback. What are you doing? Having people here talk about politics and they're all white. In fact, the people themselves said that. Why are we all white? So we pretty quickly did millennials, very diverse group. I'm going to do one more thing. Our new executive director, Keith Allred, tried about 10 years ago a pilot in Idaho in which he brought 1,500 demographically represented Idahoans together to look at tough policy issues in the state, including property tax. Is there any tougher issue at the state level than education funding, we could say, in Arizona would be tougher than property tax. His notion is to take that nationally and has created something called Common Sense American. I hope you'll all go to this website and sign up to be members, particularly those of you who care about policy. Our goal was to get to about 2,300 members by the 1st of June. We have surpassed that goal already. We have 10 members in every single state in the country and a lot more in some states. I didn't look up the Arizona number, but it means we're now far enough along to start to put policy decisions in front of the people. And if you choose to be a member, all it requires of you, you need to be a voter, but it requires 90 minutes a year to review the policy that you have been assigned. So we hope you will do that. I'm going to close at this point with a poem that moved me deeply earlier in this year. And in part I'm choosing to do this. This was a poem written by a woman named Lucy Pierce. And she was writing it for the context of the power of women's way of sensing, women's way of seeing, which is equally important for men. But I was touched to think about this women's salon. And I would like to share this with you. The title is Living Revolution. We often fear that the revolution needed is too big and that we are too small. But all that is required is that you step into the truth of your life. Speak it, write it, paint it, dance it. Shine your light on your truth for the world to see. And as hundreds, then thousands, then millions do this, each sparking the courage of yet more, suddenly we have a world alight with truth. We are shifting ourselves. We are shifting the world, dancing her into a new orbit. We are filling in the space where our voices were silenced, filling in the blanks where our images have been lacking. We are weaving her story into reality, reaching beyond his story and into new ways of being and seeing. We are the bridge between the worlds. Thank you.